My name is John Meyer, and I'm a professor of politics and environmental studies at Humboldt State University in Northern California in the U.S. At the moment, I'm a Carson Fellow at the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society in Munich, Germany. I was a participant last night in the panel on sustainable materialisms, and the question that the organizers began with was the question of what is sustainable materialism? And that's really what I chose to focus my comments on. In brief, it seems to me that it's widely recognized that the idea of sustainable or sustainability is heavily debated, deeply contested. And some people wring their hands a great deal about the fact that that leads to the concern that maybe we don't exactly know how to operationalize what sustainable is. Materialism has gotten less, I think, public attention, but I think the idea of materialism in environmental politics and in other contexts has sometimes been the idea that somehow we can ground our ideas in something much more firm, you know, in material reality itself, and that this will somehow, like with the idea of sustainability, allow us to escape from a lot of the ambiguity, a lot of the controversy, a lot of the debate that surrounds environmental politics. And I tried to suggest in my comments last night that I really think that it's a mistake to think we can escape that kind of political contest or that we should. In fact, I think in many ways, an environmentalism rooted in everyday life, rooted in a sustainable form of materialism, is a politics where we're trying to figure out a way to publicly engage with people's private practices in everyday life, right? I mean, private life in terms of what we choose to eat, where we get resources from, what we do within our own homes, becomes public when those collective choices influence the broader world that we live in. And I think that it's important to recognize that those practices can be private but also public and political at the same time. It's not an either-or sort of thing. And that's, in a very general sense, I guess, what I was trying to gesture towards in my comments last night.
Well, thank you, Elspeth and David, for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. As Elspeth just mentioned, the organizers of the forum began the materials that publicized it with a question. The question, what is sustainable materialism? I want to focus on that question, trusting that some of my fellow panelists will do a more thorough job than I will of fleshing out some of the more specific cases and examples that might manifest this. The first thing to note, as Elspeth also did, is that this phrase, sustainable materialism, is not a terribly familiar one. Yet its two components, sustainability and materialism, definitely are. So I want to begin by taking a look at those one at a time and note some similarities there. Start with the noun here, materialism. This can mean many different things, both in the academy and out. In everyday conversation, of course, to say one is materialistic indicates some sort of a preoccupation with consumer goods and other stuff. In certain parts of the university and certain historical moments, to be a materialist has been to embrace a more or less Marxist interpretation of economic production as absolutely central to the formation and shaping of social and cultural and political ideas. For philosophers, materialism is an account of physical matter as the whole of reality, in contrast to idealism's more dualistic vision of ideas and human subjectivity as apart from the matter of the world. All these, I think, have something to do with the way that materialism relates to sustainability, but none of them fully captures it. So let me just sketch two competing stories that I think capture something of an account of the development of environmental activism and environmental movements through the 20th century, and that speak to this question of materialism. The first is a fairly well-established account of the growth of environmental activism in the 20th century. It focuses on the role of new values and ideas, often in explicit contrast to conversations about material conditions. So consider, for example, that the world's first national Green Party was formed in the 1970s, not terribly far from this neck of the woods, organized in Wellington, New Zealand in 1975. But interestingly, the party wasn't known as a Green Party, it was known as the Values Party. It's an interesting term, right? Why the Values Party? What values did the party value, right? I think it could be left unspecified. It could carry a certain cultural connotation because of the widespread sense that values were somehow contrasted to a preoccupation with material economic interests. Materialism, in a more colloquial sense, is often characterized as anti-environmental, an attachment to things that seems at odds with reducing one's ecological footprint, for example. In a related manner, many have noted that environmentalism's primary constituencies are often identified as relatively educated, middle class, or affluent populations, suggesting that it's those folks who are best able to transcend immediate material conditions in order to embrace some sort of aesthetic valuing of distant landscapes, an enlightened self-interest valuing of future generations, or a moral valuing of other species. Drawing on decades of cross-national public opinion research, a political scientist named Ron Engelhardt outlined this sort of new values orientation over the past generation and has termed it post-materialism and documented its growth in post-World War II generations in increasingly affluent societies here in Australasia, Europe, North America, Japan, and elsewhere. Notice that conceived in this way, the constituency likely to support environmental action will be limited, and concerns will rarely press, urgently at least, on our everyday or our day-to-day lives. But there's other stories and other accounts of environmental movements that I think push us in a somewhat different direction. The rise of environmental justice and relatedly climate justice, food justice, transportation justice, and other such movements reflects concerns that are deeply connected with the everyday lives and livelihoods of those involved. Attention to the foods we eat, the homes we live in, our means of transportation, uses of energy, and so forth, foregrounds what are really immense webs that intricately and inextricably tie us with non-human animals and habitats, technological systems, and the built environment we live in. In this sense, they're materialist rather than post-materialist, and the frequent framing of these as justice movements, of course, also highlights the unequal power and privilege manifest in these practices. So more generally, the sense that activism is a response to real biophysical material conditions on the planet has long been a part of the environmentalist self-understanding. And even evidence from Engelhardt's own research that I mentioned before seems to undermine the claim that environmental concern is somehow restricted to affluent societies or privileged populations with so-called post-material values. But because these stories are often contrasted with each other, there's also a real danger that the materialist turn in relation to sustainability will appear as a turn to the concrete rather than the abstract, or will appear to be a focus on objective conditions rather than subjective values. Much as some might wish it to be otherwise, though, grounding sustainability in everyday material practices will not fix or determine its outcomes. The closer we look, the more it becomes clear that values, interpretations, and judgments are inextricable from the material practices of our lives. So let's talk for another minute or two about sustainability or sustainable in this context of materialism. It's often been noted that there are many definitions of the word and that there's much concern about whether it's a useful guide to decision making. I'm not going to say much about that. I don't think we should be overly surprised or troubled that, about the contested character of sustainability. Most words that inspire social and political action have competing meanings: freedom, democracy, equality, and justice, to name a few. But that really doesn't minimize their power to motivate action. I want to call attention to another quality of sustainability and sustainable. It seems to me that the idea of sustainability both promises too much and at the same time too little. How does it promise too much? Well, as with materialism, sustainability is not a final fixed state of affairs. At best, it's an aspiration, always past the horizon, requiring adjustment, ever changing. There's no such thing as a sustainable society, not just now, but there never will be. Those societies, of course, should always strive to become more sustainable. It's a journey, but can't be a destination. We need to acknowledge that openly and honestly, because when we treat it as though it's something more, it tends to encourage a sort of smug, finger-wagging moralism, I think, a certain sort of self-righteousness that in turn can foster a backlash of popular resentment against addressing environmental concerns. But let's talk about how sustainability, in a sense, offers us too little. I've noted the way that ecological sustainability is about complex webs of relationships. So let's talk about really familiar human relationships for a moment. You're sitting in a cafe, talking with a close friend, and you ask her or him, "So, how's your relationship going?" Or that relationship could be spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, significant other, whatever. And she or he answers you, "Oh, it's sustainable." Take a moment to think about why you laugh at that, right? I suspect it's because we yearn for something more in a relationship than sustainability, right? Some sort of generativity, some sense that the we represents more than just the sum of me and you. Now, of course, if we find ourselves in a dysfunctional relationship, and we are in that kind of relationship with other beings on the earth now, sustainability might seem like it is enough. It's never enough, however, because it can't inspire us to cultivate relationships in the first place, right? Another way to put it, if we set sustainability as a goal, we're likely to fail. But when we pursue other ends, we might in fact be sustaining the relationship. So what can we learn from these competing stories? I want to just conclude with three tentative ideas. The first is, we all engage with material practices in the material world on an everyday basis. That's the basis in many ways for the environmental challenges and problems, including climate change, that we face today. Therefore, it's also the only avenue for meaningfully pursuing an alternative, a more sustainable option instead. Second, while it's necessary to focus on material practices, these practices can never be isolated from our ideas and values and culture. Does that mean my time's up? Okay, all right. We shouldn't think of sustainable materialism as somehow fixing an end, but as opening up and creating a different kind of beginning. It must be a conversation in which differences are heard and addressed. And thirdly, and I think most importantly, it's precisely when our material practices lead to difference and to disagreement and to debate that they become, in a sense, public issues, that they become not just environmental issues, but in environmental politics. And that's despite the fact that many of these practices that I know some of my other panelists will talk about and that we might imagine as being these material practices are in fact ones that we typically think of as private, right? Our choices within our own homes, within our own lives, and so forth. So they're private practices, but they become public and political, not in contrast, not in some different domain, but precisely when differences and contests and different understandings of these issues, emerge. The public and political is not a space opposed to the private, but it's a quality of those everyday and private acts that affect us collectively and help constitute the world around us. Since our goal today is to open up a conversation, I'll end on that suggestive rather than a definitive note. Thank you very much.